So when you're trying to teach someone a complex series of behaviors using behavior chaining, there are a number of different methods that you can use to teach that behavior. Sometimes you will use forward chaining, and chaining backwards will you sometimes. Hi, I'm Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is Functional Analysis of Behavior 1. Let's go. All right, so today we're going to be taking a look at behavior chains, and specifically, we're going to take a look at training behavior chains. So if you haven't already, I highly recommend check out the last video where we introduced the idea of behavior chains. So just as a quick recap, Cooper, Heron, and Heward defined a behavior chain as a linked sequence of responses leading to a terminal outcome. Each response produces a stimulus change that functions as conditioned reinforcement for that response and a discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain. And we analyze this using the example of trying to learn the complex behavior of a superhero that a superhero might need, the complex behavior of stopping a getaway car full of dastardly villains. And we took a look at how that behavior can be broken up into little links so that it becomes a behavior chain, and that how for each behavior you have to do one step and then you do the next step. So first you jump in front of the car, next you put your hands on the car to stop that forward momentum, third you rip off the hood of the car, fourth you put your hands on the engine, and fifth you rip the engine out, immobilizing the getaway car full of dastardly villains. And we took a look at the power behind the behavior chain in the idea that when you get reinforced for performing that first step in the behavior, it also produces a change in the environment. And that stimulus change in your environment acts as a discriminative stimulus, telling you that the next step in the chain will now be reinforced. And then you perform that next step and you get reinforced for the next step, but it also produces a discriminative stimulus, a change in your environment that indicates that the next step in the sequence will now be reinforced, and then so on and so forth. You keep performing each step in the behavior, you keep getting reinforced, and importantly, that change that behavior causes serves as a discriminative stimulus, indicating that the next behavior will now be reinforced. And this is what allows the chain to become a chain. This is what allows it to be performed in sequence. And this is where a lot of the power of this chain comes, because that discriminative stimulus becomes a conditioned reinforcer after being associated with the primary reinforcer after many trials. And then finally, you perform that final behavior, and you have successfully completed the behavior chain. You have successfully stopped that car from escaping. So that is the entire behavior chain in sequence here represented. And what we're going to take a look at today is 4 techniques that you can use if you want to train somebody on this behavior chain. So if you want to do some behavior chain training and train the behavior chain, these are 4 techniques that you can use depending upon different factors, 4 techniques that you can use to train that behavior chain. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the method of forward chaining. And Cooper, Heron, and Heward mentioned that in forward chaining, the behaviors identified in the task analysis are taught in their naturally occurring order. Each succeeding step required the cumulative performance of all previous steps in the correct order. So I almost messed up the cumulative performance of that quote, but I finally got there. But this forward chaining requires that you perform those cumulative steps in the correct order. So let's take a look at this and break it down as if we were using it to train our superhero to stop this car full of villains. So in a forward chain, it's a little bit counterintuitive, because what you do is you only train one step in this chain at a time. So what you would do is you would start with the first step. That's the forward part of the training. You start with the first step, then the second, then the third. But in this case, you start with the first step and you only train on that first step. So you would you would tell your learner, hey, go and stop that getaway car full of dastardly villains. And they would need to perform the behavior of jumping in front of the car. And that is what we are training. So when we're training this behavior, we can use all the techniques we talked about so far. We could use response prompts. We could use shaping in order to help the individual learn the behavior of jumping in front of the car. But importantly, we don't train on any other behavior until they perform that first step correctly. So once they perform that first step correctly, they get reinforced. And then when they perform that first step correctly, not only do they get reinforced, but it also produces the discriminative stimulus that indicates that the next step in the chain can now be reinforced. And if you, once that person reaches a certain performance criteria for that first step, so let's say that we set the criteria at performing this first step correctly 3 times in a row, only then do we start training on the second step. And importantly, we stop training the first step at that time. So no more primary reinforcement for the first step. So we stop reinforcing that first behavior. And importantly, it still gets reinforced because that discriminative stimulus that occurs when that first behavior is performed, it has now acquired conditioned reinforcement properties. So it is now reinforcing that first step. So now they still have to perform the first step. The discriminative stimulus reinforces that first step, indicates that the second step will now be reinforced, and we start training them on the second step. So again, we can use shaping, we can use response prompts to help them learn that second behavior. Once they perform the second step of putting their hands on the car, we reinforce that behavior with, say, a primary reinforcer, like an edible reinforcer. We give this superhero a chocolate bar because they need the energy. But importantly, that behavior also produces a new discriminative stimulus that indicates that now the third step will be reinforced. And once they reach criterion on that second step, criterion performance, for example, in this case, performing it correctly 3 times in a row, we then begin to train the third step. So we stop reinforcing the second step because now it's being reinforced by that discriminative stimulus. And then we go all the way back to the beginning of the chain. They have to perform step number 1. That discriminative stimulus that step number 1 produces acts as a reinforcer and signals that step number 2 will now be reinforced. The stimulus change that step number 2 produces acts as a reinforcer and indicates that step number 3 can now be performed. And then when they perform step number 3 correctly, we reinforce that behavior. That produces a discriminative stimulus. Step number 3 produces that change in the environment, indicating that step number 4 can now be reinforced. And the procedure goes the same again for step number 4. So we stop training on step number 3. The learner goes all the way back to the beginning of the chain, performs step 1, 2, 3, now gets trained on step 4. When they perform it correctly, they get reinforced. That correct performance produces the discriminative stimulus that indicates that the final behavior, the terminal behavior, will now be reinforced. And then they go all the way back to step number 1 and perform 1, 2, 3, 4 before we train them on step number 5. And then finally, when they get that correct, they get reinforced. And when they reach criterion behavior on that terminal behavior, step number 5, they then have learned the entire chain. So that is forward chaining. And you might be sitting there and thinking to yourself, well, that doesn't seem very intuitive. Most of the time in our daily lives, if we were just asked to train somebody on a task, we would train them on each step every single session. We would just train them on step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on, going through the entire chain. And that is actually method number 2, and it is known as total task chaining. So in total task chaining, this is a variation of forward chaining in which the learner receives training on each step in the task on every single session. So if we were training an individual to perform this behavior chain and we were using total task training, what we would do is we would train every single behavior in this chain every single time. So we would start with behavior step number 1. And if they performed that behavior correctly, we would give them reinforcement. It would create the discriminative stimulus that indicates that step number 2 can now be reinforced. And then we would train them on step number 2. And let's say that they can't perform step number 2 correctly. Let's say that they can't do that one quite yet on their own, and we have to use physical guidance as a response prompt. Well, we don't stop the training there. We continue on to step number 3. So we help them to complete step number 2. They don't reach criteria. They're not doing it successfully. But once step number 2 is completed with our assistance, we then train them on step number 3. And if they do step number 3 correctly, they get reinforced. It produces that discriminative stimulus that moves on to step number 4. And once again, maybe they fail at step number 4 and they don't reach criteria on step number 4. But in total task chaining, we don't stop there. We go on to step number 5. And if they perform step number 5 correctly, that gets reinforced. So in total task chaining, it's like forward chaining because we're going in the forward direction. We're going forward in the sequence. However, unlike forward chaining, we train every single step of this behavior chain every single session. All right, method number 3 that we're going to take a look at is backward chaining. And when a backward chaining procedure is used, this sequence proceeds backwards, hence the name, through the chain until all steps in the task analysis have been introduced in reverse order and practiced cumulatively. So in this case, if we were training this behavior chain using a backwards chaining procedure, we would once again begin with a single behavior, but this time we're going backwards in the chain. So we begin with the final behavior. So in this case, the first 4 steps of the behavior would need to be performed for the learner. So for example, you would put them in front of the car. You would put their hands on the hood. You would actually maybe start with step 4 where the hood of the car is already ripped off and you put their hands on the engine. And then you would say, hey, stop this car full of dastardly evildoers. And you would train them on ripping the engine out of the car. Once they perform that correctly, they get reinforced. And then we start training on step number 4. So once we train on step number 4, now we're backing it up. We're going backwards in the chain. So once step number 5 reaches criterion performance, for example, 3 times in a row, we then begin on step number 4. So now we start with a ripped off hood. We put them in front of the car and we say, hey, stop this villain, this car full of villains. And now they have to put their hands on the hood. That is the behavior that we're training. And we can use shaping, we can use response prompts, but importantly, we train on this behavior until they have performed it correctly. Once they perform it correctly, they get reinforced. That correct performance produces a discriminative stimulus that indicates that the 5th step can now be performed. And now they perform the 5th step. And importantly, we do not reinforce these other steps. They're not being trained. They've already been trained. We are now only training on that 4th step. Once they reach criterion levels of performance on that 4th step, we then begin training the 3rd step. So again, the first 2 steps might need to be done for the learner. We start them with them in front of the car with the car stopped. And now we say, stop this car full of dastardly villains. And now they have to learn to rip the hood off. And once they learn how to do that, we reinforce the behavior with a primary reinforcer. It produces a discriminative stimulus that indicates that behavior 4 can then be performed. They perform behavior 4, it produces a discriminative stimulus, which acts as a conditioned reinforcer. That behavior 5 can now be performed, and they perform behavior 5, and they complete the behavior chain. And this is what we do throughout backwards chaining. We always train a particular behavior, and once that behavior reaches criterion performance, we then move 1 step previous in the chain, and we train on that behavior and that behavior alone. And when it gets reinforced, it produces that discriminative stimulus that leads to the next step. And then that produces the discriminative stimulus that leads to the next step, and so on to the end of the chain until finally we reach that 1st step in the chain. Now they perform the behavior of jumping in front of the car. Once they get that correct, they get reinforced. It produces the discriminative stimulus that indicates step number 2 will now be reinforced. And then step number 2 gets reinforced, and you proceed all the way through the chain until step number 5 occurs, and that is backwards chaining. All right, so the final method that we're going to take a look at is method number 4, and this is a variation on backwards chaining. This is backward chaining with leap aheads. And backwards chaining with leap aheads follows essentially the same procedures as backwards chaining, except selected steps are simply probed. So instead of training every single step, you can probe to see if a learner can actually perform some of these behaviors in this behavior chain. So if we were training this behavior on stopping a car full of dastardly villains using backward chaining with leap aheads, we would start with that final behavior. We would again start training at the end of the chain with that 5th behavior. However, what we might do is we might conduct a few probes and simply test the learner to see if they can do certain other behaviors. So we might say, hey, stand in front of this car and stop these villains, try ripping the hood off. And if they're able to rip the hood off, that is a successful probe. They can perform that behavior. They can get reinforced for that behavior. We then might probe behavior number 2 in this step and in this behavior chain. And maybe they can perform that behavior as well, and they get reinforced for that behavior. So we have done 2 probes and found that they can do 2 links in this behavior, And in that case, when we start training on the backwards chaining, what we would do is we would once again start with behavior number 5. We would train them on that behavior. We would put them in the correct position, put them in the correct environment where ripping the engine out is the next step to do, is the behavior that needs to be done. When they perform that correctly, they get reinforced. And then we go to step number 4, the previous step, and we start training on step number 4. And once again, we put them in the position that they need to be to perform step number 4. And once they get that correctly performed, they get reinforced. That produces the discriminative stimulus, indicating that step number 5 can now be performed. They perform step number 5, completing the behavior chain. And then if this was backward chaining, we would go to step number 3. However, this was backward chaining with leap aheads. And we've already done probes that indicate that this individual can do step 2 and step 3. So in this case, instead of going one step backwards to step 3, we would go multiple steps, leap ahead, all the way back to step number 1, and then we would start training on step number 1. So we would train on step number 1. We would say, hey, stop that car full of dastardly villains, and we would train them to leap in front of the car. And once they've done that correctly, they get reinforced. That produces a discriminative stimulus that indicates that step number 2 can now be performed and get reinforced. Step number 2 produces a discriminative stimulus that says step number 3 will be reinforced, and so on and so forth along the chain until they get to the terminal behavior. And again, remember, the power of these behavior chains comes very much from the fact that those discriminative stimuli act as reinforcers for every single step along the way. And that was backward chaining with leap aheads. All right, so that brings us to the end of today's video. So today we took a look at how to train behavior chains. We went through a very brief recap of what a behavior chain is. And then we took a look at the 4 major methods of training behavior chains. So we took a look at forward chaining. We took a look at total task chaining. We took a look at backward chaining. And then finally, we took a look at backward chaining with leap aheads. So those are the 4 major ways of training a behavior chain. And can you believe that I made it all the way through with very little errors on saying chaining and training and chain and train? And we're going to leave it at that because I almost messed up that last one. All right, so that is it for today. Next time, we're going to tackle the totally terrific tale of token economies, a very powerful and effective way to put in a reinforcement procedure in the real world, where reinforcement is sometimes difficult to do in the time and in the place where the behavior is performed. So we're going to take a look at that token economies, but that is it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. And until we see each other next time, stay frosty, stay functional. All right, let's do this. It seems like it's working. We're going to keep going. All right, here we go. All right, enough of that.